Night did not fall over Jalisco the way nights usually fall. It was not a night of crickets or mountain silence. It was one of those nights where the air changes weight, where something moves before anyone announces it. There were no open sirens, no convoy speeding in at full force. There was something more unsettling: coordination. At an hour that does not appear on public clocks, secondary roads began to close, not with municipal patrols, but with people who do not ask, who do not warn, and who do not improvise. On the radios, there were no shouted orders, only brief, dry confirmations, as if everyone knew exactly what they had come to do. And that is the first thing to understand. This was not just another raid. This was a response. Because Mencho was no longer there. Because Mencho had already escaped. Because after being surrounded, Mencho had disappeared again. And when someone like that vanishes, the message is no longer sent by looking for him. It is sent by striking everything that sustains him. The mansion was not in a poor area. It was not hidden among sheet metal roofs or alleyways. It was a large, clean, protected property. The kind that does not look criminal at first glance. The kind built to appear untouchable. That was the mistake. Because when a criminal structure feels secure, it stores what matters there. Not the visible weapons, not the noise. It stores the papers, the backups, the phones, the routes, the codes, the names that are never spoken aloud. That is why that house. That is why that night. When the perimeter was sealed, there were no screams from inside, and the lights went out as if someone believed darkness could save them. But when the ones arriving already have the map, the house can pretend all it wants. The map does not argue. The map enters. The breach was fast, not for spectacle, but to avoid seconds of advantage. Because in these worlds, 1 second is enough to delete a file, to send a message, to hide something that no one will ever find later. Inside, the scene was not war. It was order. Folders where folders should not be. Drawers with more phones than cutlery. Rooms that did not look like bedrooms but like silent offices. And that is where the first crack appears. The mansion was not a refuge. It was a node, a point where routes, money, instructions, favors, purchase silences converge. The kind of place that does not need to fire a shot because it controls from behind. Or in this reconstruction, what is being sought is not a gun on the table. What is being sought is the system. Lists without titles, nicknames without surname, numbers without names, quick notes written by someone who no longer needed to hide because they believed no one would ever enter there. And then everything makes sense. Mencho was not just a man on the run. He was a network that was still breathing. That is why the blow was not discreet, because the objective here was not only to secure, it was to demonstrate reach. When people within the Cjng begin to hear about it, they do not hear it from official statements. They hear it through rumors, cut messages, calls that do not go through, people who stop answering. They went into the house. They say they took things. They say it was federal. They say it's because of Mencho. In less than an hour, the message had traveled more kilometers than any patrol, and that is the real impact. Because striking a mansion is not just striking a property. It is breaking the idea of refuge. It is telling the entire structure there are no safe houses anymore. That they don't enter here no longer exists. For an organization like the Cjng, that is poison. Paranoia begins. Who talked? Who leaked? Who moved something wrong? Who stored what should not have been stored there? And when a structure enters paranoia, it makes mistakes. Hasty movement, night transfers, unnecessary calls, people fleeing without a plan. All of that leaves traces. Meanwhile, outside, the neighborhood does not sleep. Not because there are gunshots, but because there is uncertainty. Half-open windows, curtains barely moving. No one wants to look too much, but everyone wants to know. Because even if no one says it out loud, everyone understands the same thing. If they touch that place, the game changed. The message was not, "We captured you." It was worse. It was, "Even if you are not here, we can dismantle you." And for someone like Mencho, that weighs more than an arrest warrant. Because real power is not in hiding. It is in knowing that even if you run, everything you built still stands. That night, that certainty began to crack. Now comes the dangerous part. When a structure like this is struck, there are two possible reactions. It retreats, or it tries to demonstrate strength, and neither is silent. That is why what happened in that mansion does not stay there. It does not end when the doors are sealed. It begins when phones start vibrating in other places. Because if the environment fell, someone will try to occupy the space. And if someone tries to occupy it, someone else will get in the way. The Cjng is not one single thing. It is cells, fragile loyalties. People who obey as long as fear works. And that night, fear shifted sides. Not forever, not as a definitive victory, but enough to destabilize. At dawn, the mansion was cordoned off, not as a symbol of destruction, but as a reminder. Mencho still had not appeared, but his world had been touched. And in this kind of war, touching someone's world is more dangerous than capturing. And the question hanging in the air, the one no one answers out loud, is simple and brutal. If they entered there, how many other places can they enter? Because no one sends a message like that to stay still afterward. And here is where the story grows heavier. What people see from the outside is they smashed a mansion. But what truly happens when a place like that falls is something else. A crack opens from within. Most people think a structure is sustained by weapons. No, it is sustained by routine, by phones that ring at the same hour, by people who know exactly which door to knock on. on, which name to say, which amount to deliver, by operational confidence, by the feeling that everything is under control. That night, control broke, and here is a detail that changes the entire tone. The operation did not enter like a desperate raid. It entered like someone who already knows what they are looking for. The way they moved inside revealed everything. They did not go room by room at random. They did not search just in case. They went straight to the points where the things that are not displayed are kept. The kind of things that are not posted online. The kind of things that are not shown. The kind of things that, if they fall into the wrong hands, dismantle you without firing a shot. Inside the mansion, the first thing that changed the air was not fire. It was the uncomfortable silence of someone who knows they arrived too late to hide everything. Because when a structure is trained, it has emergency protocols. If this happens, move that. If they hit us, destroy this. If they enter, I do not let them find that. But those protocols depend on one thing, time. And that night, there was no time. That is why the raid did not feel like a search. It felt like extraction, as if authorities were pulling specific pieces from a system that had already been patiently mapped. When a mansion becomes a target, it is because it was not just a house. It was a transit point, a place where backups are stored, where cold cash is safeguarded, where devices are kept that are only turned on when something big needs to move. A place where proof of loyalty is stored. People think Mencho'S power was in hiding. It was not. It was in having such a solid network that even hidden, everything kept functioning. But if the state enters a place like that, what it is saying is, your network is no longer beyond my reach. And that has an immediate effect. Internal dispersal begins. No one wants to be the next name in a notebook. No one wants to be the next phone unlocked. No one wants to be the contact saved as cousin, who is actually the link to close a deal. And when paranoia ignites, the organization becomes its own worst enemy. Those below start suspecting those above. Those above start thinking those below already talked. And in that distrust, strange movements appear. People suddenly changing locations. People burning SIM cards at midnight. People going on vacation to places they had never stepped foot in. People disappearing without informing their own cell. For intelligence, that is gold. While boxes were being taken out inside, and another operation was unfolding outside. The one almost no one notices. The reading operation. Because a strike like this is not only about entering and taking, it is about seeing who reacts, who calls, who moves, who changes route, who disappears. In organized crime, reaction says more than the raid. And here comes the question that explodes internally. If Mencho had already escaped, why strike that mansion? Because when the leader escapes, you have two options. Chase him blindly, or strike the echo of his steps. The place where he left traces. The place where his people believe they can still breathe. The place where the structure feels comfortable. That is exactly what this operation appeared to do. Attack comfort. Not for a viral video, for panic. And panic makes people talk without being interrogated. Now, there is a point no one says out loud, but everyone thinks if they entered there, they entered with information. And if they entered with information, someone talked. It could have been a leak. It could have been a mistake. It could have been internal betrayal. It could have been an intercepted call. But you do not arrive at a mansion like that to see what comes out. You arrive when you already know the place is not innocent. So the real question is not what they took. The real question is how they got there. And that is the part that makes the Cjng sick. Because it is one thing to fight weapons. It is another to fight intelligence. A weapon is visible. Intelligence is not. You confront a weapon. Intelligence enters from behind. It turns you into a target without you knowing. That is why, while the raid advanced, what broke was not a door. It was the sense of armor. That idea of, we have people everywhere, they warn us, they cover us, they don't enter here. Because if they entered, then there is no perfect network. Then there are gaps. Then someone failed. Then someone sold. And when an organization starts hunting its own failure, things become doubly dangerous. That night, around the mansion, fear was not distributed equally. The neighbor did not know whether to feel relief or terror. Because yes, seeing a deployment like that can seem like hope, but it is also a reminder. You are living on territory that does not belong to you. Territory two sides are disputing, and you are the ground. At that hour, people do not go out to record out of bravery. They record out of anxiety, out of the need to understand what is happening. But in zones like that, recording can be a sentence. So many did not record. They just listened. They saw shadows. They smelled smoke. And in everyone's mind, the same idea remained. If the state dared to enter a symbol, the next step will not be small. And here is the most important part of this kind of script. The message. Blowing open the mansion is not just entering and searching. It is the kind of action meant to humiliate, to strip the aura of untouchable, to show that symbols burn, that luxury breaks, that refuge opens. And that has an inevitable consequence, the need for response. No organization that lives off fear can allow people to believe it can be touched, because the day people believe that, resignation breaks. And without resignation, extortion becomes harder. Control becomes more expensive. Obedience begins to fail. After a blow like this, the Cjng does not only lose things, it loses narrative. It loses the story it told to dominate. And whoever loses narrative tries to recover it the oldest, simplest way, by demonstrating strength. And that is where this becomes a board. If this mansion was a node, there are others. If If this place had backups, there are copies elsewhere. If things were stored here, someone is already running to move the rest. And if someone is running to move the rest, the operation does not stay in one mansion. It becomes a chain. A raid like this is not planned to be unique. It is planned as the first piece. The first piece falls, and the next is already marked. Meanwhile, Mencho, wherever he is, receives the blow in a way that is not physical. It is psychological, because the life of someone like that is built on control. Control over roots, over people, over silences, and when the state enters one of your symbolic places, it sends a sentence that needs no voice. Wherever you are, I can touch you. That sentence weighs more than an arrest warrant. An arrest warrant is paper. This is presence. Now comes the most uncomfortable question of all. If Mencho escaped, did he escape alone? Because an escape is rarely pure skill. It is information. It is warning. It is extra time. And if there was extra time, someone gave it. And if someone gave it, then the state is not only looking for Mencho, it is looking for the one who helped him disappear. And when the state looks for the one who helps disappear, the blow is no longer against the capo. It is against the protection system, or against the fabric, against the corruption that keeps the circuit alive. That is why stories like this do not stay in the mountains. They filter into other layers. Names begin to sound, versions circulate, audios appear, figures fall who had nothing to do with it. That is what makes people keep watching, because fear is no longer just bullets, it is uncertainty. And in the middle of that uncertainty, there is one detail that always repeats: official silence. Because when an operation like this is real, they often do not shout it immediately. They do not turn it into a conference. They wait, they process, they validate. Because announcing too early is giving information to the other side. And in these wars, information is ammunition. So while people on social media shout, they blew it open, that what is really happening is that an entire team is reviewing every connection, every number, every note, every device. Because a mansion can be empty of weapons and still be full of something worse: structure. And when authorities find structure, they do not settle for the mansion. They look for the complete map. What comes after that is no longer a raid. It is a chain reaction. And here the story becomes even more dangerous. If the Cjng feels it is being dismantled from within, it has two paths: close ranks or fracture. Closing ranks means hardening, becoming more violent, more distrustful, more aggressive. Fracturing means betrayals, internal adjustments, silent executions, people disappearing under suspicion. In both paths, one thing is certain: there will be movement, and movement reveals. So the open question is not whether the mansion burned more or less. The question is what ignited behind the smoke. Because if this mansion was the first blow after the escape, the next does not have to be a property. The next could be an operator. The next could be a liaison. The next could be someone who until today felt invisible. And when those pieces begin to fall, the chaos in the title stops being a YouTube word and becomes reality, felt in the streets, on the routes, in the strange silences, in the calls that no longer go through, in the convoys moving at dawn, in the messages circulating like knives. Because after someone touches your symbol, you are no longer fighting for territory. You are fighting for respect. And in that kind of war, no one wants to be the one who stayed silent, or the one who stayed exposed. And there is still another layer almost no one sees when a blow like this happens. It does not occur in the mansion or the cordoned street. It occurs elsewhere, in windowless offices, on dark screens, on maps not made for television. When a house of that level falls, analysts do not only examine what came out of it, they examine what stopped moving, who did not call, who did not appear the next day, which route stopped being used, which vehicle never crossed again. Because in structures like the Cjng, normality is the best camouflage. Everything functions so regularly that it stops drawing attention. And when something stops functioning, when someone breaks the pattern, that is where the crack appears. That night, while the mansion was under control, what mattered most was not what burned. It was what froze. Transfers that did not happen, payments that were not authorized, orders left unfinished, people used to receiving instructions and suddenly receiving nothing. That is devastating for an organization that feeds on obedience. Fear works while it is predictable, but when it becomes erratic, when no one knows what will happen tomorrow, fear stops being a tool and becomes internal chaos. That is where the second act of these stories begins, not the one recorded, the one whispered. At some point after the raid, someone inside the Cjng had to ask the question no one wants to ask: how much did they find? And that question has no clear answer, because when you do not know what fell into state hands, you assume the worst. You assume they found more than you thought existed. You assume someone already talked. You assume your name may be written somewhere you do not control. That kind of paranoia is not solved with weapons. It is solved with purges. And when purges begin, the noise no longer comes from outside. It comes from within. People disappearing without explanation. People no longer responding in internal groups. People leaving on their own and never mentioned again. That is what turns a symbolic blow into a slow implosion. Now understand something key. The state does not need to capture Mencho that night to gain ground. It only needs to break the stability of what he left behind. Because a leader in hiding depends entirely on his structure functioning without him. And if the structure enters panic, the hiding place stops being safe because someone will make a mistake, someone will talk too much, and someone will try to negotiate. And that someone is often the link that seemed most loyal. Meanwhile, on the street, perception shifts almost imperceptibly. It is not that people go out to celebrate. It is not that fear disappears. It is subtler, the feeling that the monster bleeds. And when a community feels the monster bleeds, it starts looking differently. It starts questioning things that were not questioned before. It starts thinking, if they entered there, maybe they are not so protected. And that thought, even unspoken, is dynamite for any criminal structure. Because real control is not maintained with bullets. It is maintained with resignation. And that night, resignation cracked. Now comes the most uncomfortable point of all. A blow like this does not occur without risks. And the risk is not immediate. The risk is what comes next. Because when you touch symbols, you force the other side to react. And reaction does not always mean a frontal attack. Sometimes it means something worse. Rearranging, moving pieces, seeking new allies, reactivating dormant contacts, trying to recover control through subtler, more selective messages. It is in that post-blow period that it is decided whether the story escalates or cools. And that is where the board becomes more complex. Because now, it is no longer a mansion versus federal forces. It is a nervous network trying to rebuild while someone observes it from above. After a night like that, there is no real calm. There is false calm, a waiting calm, a calm where everyone is measuring everyone else. The state watches who moves. The Cjng watches who falls. People watch whether fear returns to its usual place, or whether something truly changed. And that something is not measured in days. It is measured in mistakes. The first mistake is usually overreaction. The second, misdirected distrust. The third, betrayal. And when betrayal appears, the story enters its most dangerous phase, because a wounded organization tends to become more violent, but also more clumsy. It closes circles too quickly. It punishes unconfirmed suspicions. It moves resources without thinking, and all of that leaves traces. Meanwhile, Mencho remains a shadow, not because he does not exist, but because his presence is no longer necessary for the conflict to advance. The war no longer revolves around him as an individual. It revolves around what he built. And what he built has just received a surgical blow in one of its most sensitive points, the symbol of refuge. That is why raids like this are not measured by what appears in the thumbnail. They are measured by what happens weeks later, when unexplained arrests begin appearing, when operators who had never been mentioned fall, when alliances that seemed solid break. That is when it becomes clear the mansion was not the end. It was the beginning, a silent beginning, uncomfortable, slow, a beginning where no one knows exactly who will fall, but everyone knows someone will. And in that scenario, the most dangerous thing is not open violence, it is uncertainty. Because when no one knows who will be next, everyone starts making mistakes to avoid being that person. And those mistakes, piece by piece, are dismantle what once seemed untouchable. The story then is no longer just about a raid. It is about a breaking point, that exact moment when a structure looks at itself in the mirror and does not recognize itself. Because after your refuge is touched, you no longer fight to expand. You fight to survive. And in that fight, not everyone fits. And that is where this story reaches its most uncomfortable point to close. What happened that night was not the end of anything. It was not a definitive victory. It was not a clean blow with applause and orderly exit. It was a crack in the idea of control, a crack in the sense of refuge, a crack in the narrative that there were untouchable places. The mansion fell, yes, but what was truly dangerous was not what broke within those walls. It was what was exposed outside them. From that moment on, the Cjng no longer operates with the same calm. Every movement weighs more. Every call generates doubt. Every silence becomes suspicious. And Mencho, wherever he is, can no longer trust that what he left behind functions as it did before. Because when your refuge is touched, when your environment is exposed, when your comfort is taken away, power begins to erode from within. The state did not need to capture him that night to send the message. The message was clear without words. There are no sacred places. And messages like that are not sent to stay still afterward. Now everything remains in apparent pause, a tense pause, the kind where no one lowers their guard, because everyone knows what comes next is rarely announced. After a blow like that, there are only two possible paths. Either the structure retreats and begins to collapse on its own, or it tries to respond to prove it is still alive, and either path has consequences. The mansion was left behind, cordoned, empty, turned into a symbol. But the question that truly matters is not there. The question is, who will make the next mistake? Because in this silent war, the one who errs first does not get a second chance.